My plan tonight is to talk to you about state constitutions. And the plan is to talk for 30, 35, 40 minutes, somewhere around there, and then we'll have a break, and then I'll talk some more after that. So this is just to give you an idea logistically of where we're going to be and how long we're going to be doing things. So when one thinks about constitutions in the American context, it's natural that the most immediate and obvious thing that you think about is the national Constitution, the US Constitution. For decades, the study of it appears to be up and down, right? That's annoying, isn't it? No? Okay. For decades, the study of the US Constitution dominated the realm of constitutional interpretation. For political scientists, for historians, for people in law schools, scholars all across those areas were really primarily interested in the national constitution. And what that meant was that state constitutional ideas, theory, history, structure was really kind of a second-class citizen. Nobody was really interested in state constitutions, with a few exceptions. There are two state constitutions that got a lot of attention from the 18th century. One was the Virginia 1776 state constitution, and the other was the Massachusetts 1780 state constitution. We'll hear more about them later on. Each of them has been studied a lot, but that was pretty much the state of play up until about the 1960s. And starting in the 1960s, state constitutions began to be looked at, but again, primarily for what they could tell us about the US Constitution. People were only really interested in terms of, well, trying to figure out what they could learn from state constitutions based on what they could tell us about the national one. And since then, since the 60s, scholars have paid a lot more attention to state constitutions in the 19th and 20th centuries. I have a friend, Silvana Sadali, who works on 19th century state constitutions. But those from the 18th century still kind of are a backwater in terms of scholarship. There's not a whole lot that is written about them. Scholars aren't terribly keen to study them. The US Constitution continues to get the lion's share of attention. So in tonight's talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain a bit more about state constitutions from this period, and that means we're going to be spending a fair bit of time on the period from 1775 to 1780. But as you'll see, we're actually going to take some time going all the way back to the 1400s, period from the 1400s to the 1600s, and spend a little bit of time, maybe no more than, say, 5 or 10 minutes, talking about what came before those state constitutions. Because to understand state constitutions, you have to understand the context that people wrote them in. They were part of a continuum of earlier documents that we don't hear a lot about today. So when our ancestors were drafting state constitutions in the 18th century, they were calling from their experience and the experience of their parents and their ancestors on these earlier documents. And so to be able to understand what they did in the 1760s and 70s and 80s, we're going to go back and spend a little bit of time looking at that earlier period. And where we begin is with charters. Charters were an earlier set of legal documents that explorers and colonists got when they left Europe and they began traveling westward across the Atlantic to explore and possibly settle new regions that were very far away from Europe. So that's where we begin. Starting in the 1400s and going forward into the 1700s, the European monarchs, this one happens to be Charles II from England, European monarchs issued charters to explorers and also to groups of colonists. And they were called charters. They were also sometimes called letters patent. You may have heard of patent leather, like patent leather shoes. Yeah, it's spelled the same way, or like a patent. If you have an invention, you take out a patent. But this is letters patent, and that's another word for a charter. And these charters were given to explorers and colonists, and they were designed to describe the kind of political institutions that would operate wherever they decided to get off of a ship and settle. It might describe that there would be a governor, or there would be a council, or there would be an assembly, and whether there were any limits to the types of laws that could be created in those colonial assemblies. Okay, so there might be certain types of laws that were excluded, that were carved out, that the king said you can't pass a law about X, or you can't make a law about Y. These earliest royal documents granted land, but frequently they were vague. The language used in them was sometimes kind of vague. Indeed, the French and the Swedish kings made no promises that the people who crossed the Atlantic and settled in places like what we now call New York, New Netherlands to them, that they would be protected the same way that citizens living in the Netherlands were. If you got on a ship from the United Netherlands, then maybe you would be and maybe you wouldn't be treated the same way as somebody who stayed at home. Now, in England, Elizabeth I granted letters patent, or a charter, to a guy named Humphrey Gilbert in 1578. And what she said in that charter was that the Englishmen who ventured with him would be guaranteed to, quote, enjoy all the privileges of free denizens and persons native to England. Now, you probably know Gilbert's half-brother a little bit better. His name was Walter Raleigh. And Walter Raleigh went to Queen Elizabeth when he was planning to do his explorations, and he received similar assurances from Queen Elizabeth in his charter, that the settlers who went with Sir Walter Raleigh would be protected as, quote, if they had been born and personally resident within our said realm. But some very important guarantees got left out, okay? Neither of these grants to Humphrey Gilbert or to Walter Raleigh included language that there would be courts or that there would be judges. They were charters saying, you're guaranteed justice if you travel here. You have rights that will be the same as if you stayed in England. Well, what happens if somebody infringes on those rights? How do you get it fixed? No courts. That would be a problem. James I, who followed Elizabeth, James I's first Virginia charter, which he issued in 1606, offered the same kinds of promises, that the Virginia subjects would, quote, enjoy all the liberties, franchises, and immunities within any of our dominions as if they had been abiding and born within this our realm of England. Well, that didn't promise courts. It didn't promise English law. It didn't promise judges. It didn't promise a lot of things. Only that a subject who went overseas, or let's say a female subject who had a child that was born overseas, would enjoy the same liberties and protections from the king as if they had never left. Now, these grants raise a real interesting question. How are you, as a subject of the crown, supposed to get a repair if your liberties are infringed upon? If somebody takes a shot at you, attempted murder, right? What if somebody comes in your house and steals all your belongings? What if your home is burgled? Right? You could be subject to all kinds of problematic things if there's no court system. Well, in Virginia, this vagueness lasted 5 years. And in 1611, James I granted a new charter to Virginians that gave them the power to hold criminal courts. Well, that's great. Now attempted murder is off the books. Getting your home burgled is off the books. But that still leaves a lot of ground, right? You don't have civil courts, right? You don't have the ability to go in and sue your neighbor because his cows wandered into your field and ate all your corn, right? You don't have the ability to get a civil trial. And all of these charters, whether it's Humphrey Gilbert or Walter Raleigh or any of the others, all charters came with what we would call a take-back clause. The king could always take back his charter. He didn't have to give you a reason, didn't have to offer an explanation. If he wanted to take the charter back, he could. And so it could be revoked. A charter could be given with one hand this week and revoked next week. So this is kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around, that you might think you'd be willing to go live someplace where the legal standards are so thin on the ground that you might be subject to all sorts of problems that you can't get solutions for. But people were desperate. In the early 1600s, they'd go anywhere. They'd get on any boat. There's famine. There's overcrowding in London. There are lots of reasons why people decide to travel to a place like Virginia. Now, culturally, these 17th century English settlers arrived in the New World wanting to know the law. They may not have had many guarantees, but they were desperate to know what the law was. It was like an obsession. They wanted to know what laws applied to them. And printed copies of charters were bestsellers. They were the hot #1 ticket thing to buy. As soon as you got off the ship from England, people would go and they would buy a copy of whatever the charter was for whatever colony they landed in, because they wanted to know what their liberties, what kinds of protections a court might offer them. They were the first and oldest published legal documents in America. They're the oldest things we've got that talk about law. And each new shipload of emigres snapped them up like just a hot loaf of bread. They were eager to know what the nature of their government would be like and what their privileges as individuals would be like. Colonists treated charters the same way we think about constitutions. They viewed them as protecting their liberties, as spelling out what their government would be like, as descriptions of local government structures and their privileges as subjects of the crown, with fixed qualities. In fact, a lot of colonists didn't seem to realize that every charter came with a take-back clause. They thought of them as permanent. Once you got a charter, it's ours, right? We get to keep it. And they just kind of conveniently looked over the section that always said that the king had the right to revoke a charter whenever he felt like it. The early and mid-17th century charters had a lot of silences, which gave colonizers a lot of room to do what they wanted to do. They could innovate. They could make laws that they weren't supposed to. Remember I said that charters could say they had carve-outs that you couldn't make laws about this or laws about that. One of the biggest areas that was usually carved out of charters was to say you can't make laws about Native Americans. That's restricted to the Crown and Parliament. They're the only people who can make laws about Native Americans. Colonists ignored that. Colonists made laws about that anyway. If it's about making a peace treaty or negotiating some kind of settlement or buying land from Native Americans, they very conveniently ignored that there was a restriction. And so the colonizers, like I said, innovated. They varied a lot from English practices, which they weren't supposed to do. In New England and in Massachusetts in particular, there were so many variations. There were so many kind of odd laws being passed that eventually the Massachusetts charter came under the scrutiny of the Crown. So they'd had a charter for roughly over 50 years. But starting in the 1670s, that's our next stop. Recall we're learning about where state constitutions came from. First there's charters, and now those charters are coming under scrutiny. And the scrutiny starts in the 1670s and it lasts until roughly the 1720s. So these charters are coming under scrutiny because the royal crown thinks in England that the colonists are doing too many things they should not, or that their laws aren't like the laws of England. Well, they weren't. If you know anything about Massachusetts, you know that the people who settled there were highly religious. And one of the things they did was that they frequently made their laws have biblical punishments. So many stripes to be struck on someone's bare skin, and other kinds of penalties that were drawn, most of them from the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament. Well, this wasn't how English law looked at all. And so, like I said, starting in the 1670s, the Massachusetts Constitution came under scrutiny. And in 1684, the person who was the English king then, Charles II, decided to vacate the Massachusetts Charter. He exercised his take-back clause. So he took back the Massachusetts Charter. And for the next 7 years, Massachusetts residents didn't have a charter. They had all kinds of upheaval because the Crown had appointed somebody to oversee their government, but it didn't have to listen to them. The new royal governor didn't have to listen to the residents. So the fellow who was the new royal governor during this period when there's no charter, he instituted new tax laws without consulting anybody. He instituted all types of laws that restricted holding town meetings. He didn't want people to get together and talk about why they were dissatisfied. He passed new laws that restricted some of their religious practices because he was not a Puritan, like many of them were. And colonists in Massachusetts thought that this period without a charter, if it went far enough, they were afraid for their property. They were afraid that their property, their land, would be taken from them. Because if there's no law, then how do you have rights to property? How do you have property in land, in a house, in a business, in anything? It's all arbitrary, and who knew how far things would go if there wasn't a charter to protect them? Now, in the end, they didn't lose their land, and they didn't lose their property. They got a new charter, the second charter in 1691. And after they got that charter, the Massachusetts colonists never forgot what it was like to live without one. And they were very jealous of their rights. We'll see Sam Adams in a little bit later, and how he is one of these people who's very jealous of the Massachusetts colonists because of the charter, because they know what it's like to live when their rights might be stripped away. Now, the same thing that's happening in America is happening in England, and that's why 1688 is on this slide. The kings in England were not just high-handed when it came to revoking charters in America, they were also being high-handed with their own English subjects living at home. To threaten Parliament, the king parked an army on a hill overlooking London to threaten Parliament, basically to intimidate them so that they would pass laws like he wanted. And that wasn't the only thing. He tried to tax them without their consent and many other things. And eventually in 1688, the king, James II, brother of Charles II, was forced to abdicate. He was forced to flee for his life. And he was replaced. After he abdicated, he was replaced by his half-sister Mary and her husband William. And you know them probably better as the William and Mary of the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And when they became monarchs, they had to make a deal. The folks in Parliament were so fed up with having their laws revoked or ignored, with being taxed without their consent, with having an army parked up on a hill overlooking London to threaten and intimidate them, that they took steps to limit what the king could do. And when William and Mary became joint monarchs over England, they did so with conditions. Parliament created something called the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights was created, it was passed in 1689, but basically William and Mary were told, sign it or else. We'll get somebody else. If you don't want to accept these conditions from us, then we don't want you as our monarch. And they accepted. And so that's how they became king and queen. But effectively, it became a contract, if you will, between the new monarchs and Parliament, between the new monarchs and their people, that there would always be limits on what the crown could do. Going forward, now there would be limits on the monarchy. And like I said, this English Bill of Rights, which they come over in 1688, they're presented with this document in 1689. The English Bill of Rights becomes the model for later state bills of rights or state declarations of rights, and eventually a model for our Bill of Rights, our national Bill of Rights. Now, the English Bill of Rights had sections on how many courts could be created, what was the legitimate method for creating courts, that only Parliament could tax the people, that the king couldn't try to tax without them, and so on and so forth. Basically, it was a set of protections. Protections for Parliament, protections for the English people. And in early America, colonists here looked across the ocean, they looked at this English Bill of Rights, and they thought of it as theirs too. They didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as Britons, as English men and women. Right, we're still in 1691. There is no revolution on the horizon. People are happy to be subjects of the English crown. And when the English Bill of Rights comes into existence, they happily claim it. It's theirs. So when colonists are thinking about the laws that guide their governments and give those governments legitimacy, they think about their own colonial charters, and they think about the English Bill of Rights. Those are two foundations of their thinking, and they were, to the colonists, like constitutions. They aren't necessarily constitutions, but they are documents that indicate what legislatures could do, what governors could do, what privileges ordinary people could expect, and they believed that their charters protected them, just like the English Bill of Rights protected them. But something unusual was happening in the 18th century, something that when it comes to the word constitution, we have to take a look at pretty closely, actually. And that is, what is a constitution? When the English used the word constitution in the 1730s, 1750s, 1770s, when the English used this word, the majority of Englishmen used it in a way we would have found unfamiliar. It doesn't sound right to us. To them, they thought that a constitution defined the institutions, the crown, Parliament, and the courts, as well as all of the actions that those institutions took. So all the royal decrees, all the laws created by Parliament, all the decisions made by royal courts, they are the Constitution too. It's not just institutions, it's all the actions they take. That's the Constitution to an Englishman in the 1700s. Okay, so now we're going to play a little thought experiment. If that's the definition of a constitution, is it possible to do in government an unconstitutional act? I got no. Okay, yeah, you're right. You can't do an unconstitutional act. If this is your definition of a constitution, that it's everything, all the institutions plus everything they do, it's impossible to do an unconstitutional act. So this is the way that most people in England and a lot of people living in the American colonies believed. When they talked about a constitution, that's what they meant. Now, there was a small minority who thought differently. We're interested in them. Small minority of English people believed that government was limited in what it could do, that there were limits, there were boundaries. And this small group of people believed that if there wasn't a document spelling out what government functions could be and that limited their authority, that there was some higher law, some higher authority that limited what government could do, what Parliament could do. And the group of people who believed this were called Wilkesites. And the Wilkesites were never in the mainstream in England. They are the radical loony fringe. They are about as far out as Pluto for the folks living in England politically. The vast majority of folks living in England and a large number of colonists in America believe the first definition, that it's all the government is and all the actions it takes, that's what a constitution is. But like I said, there's this radical loony fringe, the Wilkesites, who think that there's some kind of limit on what a government can do. Well, those ideas travel to America in the writings of a man named John Wilkes, hence Wilkesites. He and his followers, including a couple of very influential guys named Trenchard and Gordon, as well as others, wrote extensively about the fact that Parliament and the king were limited in what they could do. And those ideas took root in America. Radical loony fringe in England, mainstream thinking in colonial America. So we've got colonists who are beginning to use the word constitution a little bit differently from the way people in England do. By the time you get to the middle of the 18th century, they're using the word constitution a little bit differently. That there is some kind of higher authority, higher power that limits what a king can do, what a parliament can do, and so forth. And they begin to go back and think about those documents and try to think about, well, what would it be that would control what a king or the parliament could do? Well, the English Bill of Rights and our charters. Our charters would place limits. Okay, now you can see how this is pretty poor reasoning. Because if the king gives you a document, do you think that the king would honestly grant you a document that says there are things the king can't do? But like I said, this is how they're thinking in the middle of the 18th century. And they go farther back than the English Bill of Rights and their charters. They go back to Magna Carta. They claim Magna Carta, the Great Charter, is what Magna Carta means. They claim that as the first of all charters. And they say that places limits upon what the king can do. Now, the people who are sent over to rule them, the people who are going to be royal governors in all of the colonies, having been born and bred in England, they don't think this way. They think the way that most Englishmen do, that there can't be anything unconstitutional that a king or parliament could ever do. And when they run into these folks in many different colonies who say, no, there are limits. There are limits to what Parliament can do. They can't tax us. They can't do this or that. The royal governors are like, who are you people? Where did you get this? Oh, gosh, they've gotten it from the Wilkesites. Okay, right, radical loony fringe. And so a lot of the people who come to America as governors, royal governors, start thinking of the folks who are most vocal, most outspoken in their complaints about British government as the radical loony fringe, right? Because they're just like the Wilkesites. And these royal governors, they repeatedly say, no, you misunderstand. You don't understand. You've got your history wrong. You've got your theory of law wrong. There is no power that can place limits on what Parliament or the king may do. One of the things we need to bear in mind is that they all use the words inconsistently. Sometimes they don't say the word Constitution. Sometimes instead what they say is they use the phrase, the form of government. And that's sometimes a phrase you'll see when they're talking about constitutions, meaning a plan, some kind of detailed plan for governing. Okay, enough of our dive into political philosophy. Okay, let's come forward a little bit in time to events that may be a little more familiar to you. The First Continental Congress meets in 1774 in the fall. And the reason that it meets has to do with the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party takes place in 1773, and in response, Parliament closes the port of Boston. What else did they do in response to the Tea Party? They revoked the Massachusetts Charter. Massachusetts, right back to where they were in 1684, they've had their charter, the second charter, revoked by the Crown. And so the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774, and they're trying to figure out how they can help the people in Massachusetts. And they agree to try to send a petition to the king and to Parliament and to their merchant friends. They send 3 different documents to England to try to ask all of them, can you get these laws repealed? Can you give Massachusetts its charter back? Can you open the port of Boston back up again? Can you take the army that's occupying Boston away? And having sent these documents, the First Continental Congress goes home. And they agree to reconvene in the spring of 1775. And they are the government that is sitting in Philadelphia in March when, in April, the shooting starts in Lexington and Concord, right? And there is no Third Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress serves with changes in personnel through the rest of the war to 1783. But as various governments are shutting down, they are being replaced. Not using royal authority under charters, not using any kind of document to give them legitimacy at all. But these new government groups are coming into being all over the place. They are coming into place at town governments. They're replacing colonial governments, the Colonial Assembly that's meeting in Boston. General Gage, who's the military governor of Massachusetts, says, go home. And instead, they decamp to Cambridge, and they start meeting as the Provincial Congress. And so there's a Provincial Congress at the state level. There's a Continental Congress. Where do they get their legitimacy from? Nowhere. They haven't got documents to back them up. All they have from their legitimacy is what power the people have given them. Right? That's where their legitimacy comes from. And each one derives its legitimacy from the one below it. So the people at town meetings, at the Committee of Safety in Lexington, elect delegates to go to the Provincial Congress, the state level Congress that's meeting in Cambridge. The Provincial Congress at Massachusetts elects delegates to go to the Continental Congress. Do they have any right to do this? You know, they're going to do a lot of things. Those state provincial congresses, they're going to try to tax and build roads. They're going to try to, levy troops to send into battle. They're going to do a lot of things. But they have to start thinking about where they get their legitimacy from. They have to have something that says, why are we legitimate? And so the first Provincial Congress of Massachusetts meets starting in October 1774. Roughly the same time as the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And that Provincial Congress will meet repeatedly throughout the entirety of the war. When they learn that General Gage, who is the military governor of the state, had ordered troops, the British troops, to go to Lexington, they were on their way to Concord to look for powder stores, to try to seize rebel leaders, the Provincial Congress deposes Gage as governor. That's their first act. One of their very first acts. And they then realize they have nothing to back this up. They have no document at all. And so they write to the Continental Congress And you can see here the proceedings for the Provincial Congress in Massachusetts and the first and second Continental Congress sitting in Philadelphia. They needed some kind of government, and so they write to the Continental Congress and they ask for advice. Ask for advice. How do we do this? How do we have a government? How do we, quote, establish a civil government, which we think absolutely necessary for the salvation of our country? And so we enter this next stage where Massachusetts asks the Continental Congress for help. Help us. And they said, you know, look, we are willing to accept a general plan as Congress might direct. If Congress has a plan, send it to us, right? We will take your plan for a government, just send us one. Congress doesn't have a plan to send. That sounds like a bad joke given today, right? Given current affairs, but no, the Continental Congress did not have a plan. What they had instead was a recommendation. They sent a resolution back, a resolution from June 9th. Congress recommended that the Massachusetts men choose representatives and that the Assembly should govern until a governor of His Majesty's appointment will consent to govern the colony according to its charter. That is to say, we're happy to take back royal government. That's fine, so long as you follow the charter. Well, of course, the charter had been vacated. There was no charter for them to govern under. This was never going to happen, right? And so you can see here from the Continental Congress's side, as this is the middle of 1775, they're hoping for reconciliation. They're hoping that the Crown and Parliament will get it together and send a governor who will try to govern under the charter, Like I said, this isn't going to happen. By the time we get to this point in 1775, virtually all of the colonies are running their own governments without royal governors. Everywhere royal governors retreated to their ships, the Royal Navy, they left the colonies behind, and every colony, now by the king considered to be in rebellion, was in the same bind. They have a government, but they have no document to legitimate its authority. Massachusetts was not the only one to ask for advice. In October of 1775, New Hampshire wrote to the Continental Congress asking for advice and direction about how to administer justice and regulate our civil police. 2 weeks later, the Continental Congress comes back and resolves that New Hampshire needs to summon a gathering and form a government to best produce the happiness of the people. That's the direction that Congress gives. Produce a government that will generate happiness for your people. Okay, so thus vaguely directed, New Hampshire comes together and creates a new state constitution in January of 1776, and it's deliberately partial and temporary. The boxes that I've circled for you there basically say, during the present state of our unhappy affairs, we have to do this. But this is only temporary. There's a lot of hand-waving to basically say, if you'll send us a royal governor who will govern under the charter, we would be happy to have him. And, you know, it's only meant to be temporary. But it is the first constitution drafted by a state. It's provisional during the present unhappy dispute, as they put it, between the colonies and Great Britain. Finally, on May 10th, 1776, the Continental Congress asked the states to form new governments. The situation had been in flux now for a year and a half, and now Congress finally takes action. And what they did was they passed another resolution. They recommend that all colonies where no government sufficient to the exigencies of their affairs has been hitherto established to adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents. You know, we have to have government. That's important. Do they have any directions about, you know, will you have a governor? Will you have an assembly? Will you have courts? Nada. Continental Congress is not sending directions. You guys dream it up. You guys figure it out. What kinds of governments the governments would be, Congress did not say. Basically only that they should best conduce to the happiness and safety of the constituents. They suggest that it would be good if the government power was derived from the people. They don't say how to do that either. And this is the language, that government power is derived from the people. This is language that 2 months later, Jefferson's going to use in the Declaration of Independence, that the power of government is derived from the authority of the people. So this represents something of a step forward in their thinking, at least as far as Congress is concerned. Now the states have to get to drafting. They have to be ready to start drafting. And in the period, we're going to advance one more, states are going to begin to draft their constitutions. In 1776, at the same time that we're celebrating a declaration, states are going to begin to craft state constitutions. And between May 1776 and April of 1777, we're going to see 13 state constitutions get written. Now, it's hard to capture the excitement that's going on during this time. For John Adams, he said it was the most exciting event of a lifetime. Now, John's a little prone to saying a little bit, everything's an epoch with Adams. Everything is an excitement. But he really was clear. This was the exciting event of a lifetime. Certainly for a lawyer, it was the exciting event of a lifetime. How many lawyers get to draft constitutions from scratch? Now, so for those of you who are trying to figure out what are the great turning points of the revolution, I would argue that it's not necessarily independence so much as it's when the states get turned loose to think about drafting state constitutions. They have a clean slate. They can do anything. They can write anything they want. David Ramsey, who was from South Carolina, and he was a doctor. He was also a historian who lived through this time and later became one of the first historians to write about the American Revolution. He wrote in his book, History of the American Revolution, what a title. He wrote that in no age and in no other country did man ever possess an election of the kind of government under which he could choose to live. The constituent parts of ancient free governments were thrown together by accident. The freedom of modern European governments was, for the most part, obtained by concessions or liberality of monarchs or military leaders. In America alone, reason and liberty concurred in the formation of constitutions. And they do it so fast, so fast. Like I said, in a year, we're going to get 13 state constitutions. Now, if you count very quickly, you'll see there's only 11. And you might say, where are the other two? Well, in fact, 2 states choose to take their royal charters and turn them into state constitutions. And what they do is they file off the part that says the crown grants or his royal authority or the power of Parliament or whatever, and they insert the power of the people of Connecticut or the power of the people of Rhode Island. Those are the 2 where basically they just copied their original charters, lock, stock, and barrel, rather than draft whole new ones. They simply removed every reference to the English monarch and English authority and instead inserted words like the people and the Rhode Island government or the Connecticut government instead. But even if you take these 2 away, that's still 11 in a year, which is still rather amazing. And they need to do this fast because some towns are beginning to question the authority of those provincial congresses. They're beginning to say, what gives you the right to tax? What gives you the right to summon our men to arms, to go into battle? And that's part 2. And we'll come back and talk about part 2 after our break. Okay, so where we left off was that people are beginning to question the provincial Congress's authority. Why can they tax us? Why can they tell us what to do? Where do they get their legitimacy from? And so we've got towns. I'm going to focus on Massachusetts for a lot of this. In Massachusetts, there are people who are beginning to question the authority of the provincial Congress. The good people out in Berkshire County, out here in the West, complained in June 1775 that the provincial Congress in Massachusetts was appointing judges for them. Why can't we nominate our own judges? Why do we need these guys in Boston to nominate judges for us? 6 months later, in December of 1775, the inhabitants of Pittsfield, it's the biggest town in Berkshire County, were calling for the popular election of the governor. Why should the provincial Congress get to pick the governor? Why shouldn't the people pick the governor? And the people in Hampshire County in March of 1776 were complaining that the provincial Congress had set the specific date that their county court was going to meet. How dare they? I mean, this is not even the ones who were complaining about taxes. People all over Massachusetts were complaining. They wanted a new government, they wanted it soon, and they wanted it to be legitimate. So no wonder that the delegates at the provincial Congress were ready, even eager, to draft a state constitution. By the time you get to summer of 1776, they got these vague directions from the Continental Congress. Remember those? To form a government that will conduce to the happiness and safety of the people? Great. So with basically no directions and with growing vocal complaints from their own constituents, that means they can't form a new government document too soon. So in the fall of 1776, the provincial Congress in Massachusetts makes an offer. They offer to the towns of Massachusetts that they will draft a constitution. The provincial Congress will draft it. They send this information, this offer, out to the 260 towns that were recognized in Massachusetts, the 260 towns that sent representatives to the provincial Congress, that had previously sent delegates to the colonial assembly under the Royal Charter. And here's what they wrote in September 1776. Would the towns, quote, consent that the present House of Representatives of this state of Massachusetts Bay consult, agree on, and enact such a constitution and form a government of the states as will most conduce to the safety, peace, and happiness of the state. Now, we only have replies from 90 towns out of the 260 they wrote to. So it's a small sample size. But the majority of towns voted no. Now, these are the same people who are complaining, right? But they vote no. They thought, and I'm going to show you some of the places where the people who are saying no come from. The people in Wareham's down here near Cape Cod, the people in Wareham thought that wartime was an inappropriate time to be constitution making, that we should wait for peace. Or they wanted to involve more people than just the members of the legislature. The folks in Boston and in Attleboro wanted to involve more people than just the legislature in the whole process. And it was the town of Concord, just to the northeast of Boston. They pointed out a critical problem. Quote, the Supreme Legislature are by no means a body proper to form and establish a constitution or form a government. Why not? Well, first of all, a constitution should protect individuals from encroachments by the government. And second, as they put it from Concord, the same body that forms a constitution have of consequence a power to alter it. You make it, you can change it. And therefore, a constitution, as they put it, alterable by the Supreme Legislature is no security at all to the subject. You make it, you can change it, we don't trust you. That's what that's saying. The good people of Concord, as well as those in Worcester County and other places, demanded that there be a special convention held that would draft the Constitution and do nothing else. That the legislature would not be given the power to do this. Okay, so despite the negative answers from 90 towns all over the state, east, west, north, The Provincial Congress of Massachusetts went ahead and started to try to draft a constitution anyway. Now, we're missing 170 town responses, so it's possible that those 170 towns were all the ones that said, yeah, go ahead. But there were 90 that said no, and they ignored them. Uh-oh. So they asked the towns to send representatives to the next provincial congress prepared to draft a state constitution, and the drafting started in 1777, and they had a draft ready to send out for the towns to look at in 1778. The Massachusetts towns read it, debated it, provision by provision, and then they rejected the Constitution of 1778 by 5-1. This is not good enough. Now, towns weren't required to send in their reasons, but being Massachusetts, a lot of them did. A lot of them went ahead and told their objections, and they came in every shape and size. We have 173 town responses on why they rejected. So that's a better sample out of the 260 towns. And like I said, the objections came in every flavor, every shape and size. Towns continued to object, like the good folks. Remember the folks in Wareham who said we should wait for peacetime? Well, the folks in Essex County said the same thing, right up there in the northeast corner. They said, we should postpone framing a state constitution until public affairs are in a more peaceable and settled condition. Now, you might think that that's enough. The good folks of Essex went on to give them 18 more reasons why they didn't like this draft constitution. 23 towns objected to allowing the governor and Senate to appoint officers like judges to sit on county courts. Many wanted a Bill of Rights, listing privileges that individuals could call on to protect themselves. A number of communities wanted mandatory rotation in office. You could only serve for so many years, and then you had to go back to doing your job as a butcher or whatever. Various towns objected to paying their representatives. They wanted them to serve for expenses only. So you basically get how many miles, you get per diem for your miles and what your expenses were staying at the inn on your way there, but you wouldn't get any pay. And at least 5 towns objected to having a property qualification, because this first draft constitution had a property qualification, that you had to own so much property or own so much money to be able to serve as governor or to serve in the legislature. And I'll single out 3 more towns that are worth hearing their objections: Concord, Lexington, and Beverly. Concord, Lexington, and Beverly went back to the problem that Concord had talked about originally. They wanted to have a special convention draft the Constitution of the state, and they didn't want the legislature. In fact, the good people of Concord took a head count. It was unanimous. The entire town of Concord voted against having the legislature draft a constitution. Okay, so in February of 1779, the Massachusetts legislature finally gives up and says, okay, fine, you didn't want us to draft it, we tried, you didn't like it, we're gonna follow your demand for a special constitutional convention whose only job would be to draft a state constitution. And they asked the towns whether that would be a better method, and the towns came back and said yes. 2-1, yes, we want a special convention. So in June of 1779, the legislature told the towns, hold elections, send us delegates. And the towns did that and more. They gave many of their delegates instructions. These are things we want to see you put into our state constitution. We only have a few of those instructions left. There's like about 10. So it's a very, very small sample size. But of the ones that are left, most of them share a common feature. They wanted a Bill of Rights. They expected this new state constitution to have a Bill of Rights, some kind of statement of rights. Now, of course, where did those towns get that idea from? The English Bill of Rights, right? You're sitting there and you're thinking, 1689, I know exactly where this story goes. And if the English Bill of Rights could place restraints on what a king and queen could do, then a Bill of Rights might also place limits on what a governor or a state legislature might do. But they can also look not just to the English for examples, they can look, by this point, like I said, it's 1779, they can look to other states, which by this point, many of them have passed Massachusetts and have crafted their own state constitutions. There are lots of models to choose from. And in particular, the folks in Massachusetts seem to be drawn to the Virginia document. The Virginia document that was ratified in June of 1776. They liked the fact that the Virginians had two different documents, one a Declaration of Rights and the second a state constitution. They liked that. They described that the Declaration of Rights seemed to include a lot of the same things that were found in the English Bill of Rights, that were found in Magna Carta. And I mean, Massachusetts is not the only one copying off of somebody else's paper. Maryland and Delaware copy chunks of the Virginia state constitution. And Pennsylvania and North Carolina copy off of Delaware and Maryland and Virginia's paper. And so big chunks of these constitutions are being absorbed into later documents, which means each sequential state constitution gets longer, right? Each of these documents is longer than the last one because they're copying material that they found from these earlier documents, these earlier constitutions. 6 of these had declarations of rights, like Virginia did. But there were plenty of states that didn't actually include a statement of rights. New Jersey, for example. New Jersey didn't have a Declaration of Rights or a Bill of Rights. A lot of these they have language that's very flowery, that's very high-minded, that's very idealistic. The people in Maryland, their draft for their state constitution said that they hope to create a sure foundation and more permanent security. And the folks in Pennsylvania talked about the security and protection of the community as such. I mean, they're talking about, why are we building this document? Why are we going to the trouble? It's because we are, as a community, we need it. Okay, so getting back to Massachusetts for a minute. Okay, the states are drafting, Massachusetts rejects, and now we come to the second state constitution for Massachusetts. In 1779, they're drafting it. And they've had their special convention, the delegates have arrived, and there are loads of them, more than 260. And the convention meets in September of 79, and they create a committee of 30 to draft a constitution. One can only imagine what would happen if you locked 30 people in a room and told them to draft anything, much less a constitution. And you'll be happy to know that that committee named a subcommittee of 3. And of those 3, one guy did most of the work. So the committee of 3 was James Bowdoin, and James Bowdoin was the second governor of the state of Massachusetts after John Hancock was governor. He's the second governor. And it was also Sam Adams, perhaps more familiar to you from the beer bottle. But you'll notice in this portrait by John Singleton Copley, what Sam Adams is pointing to. He's pointing to the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. That's what's on the table in front of him. If you could look closely enough, what's the document that he's pointing at? That's what's important to these people, their charters. And the third person, the one who did all the work, was Sam's cousin, John Adams. He was basically the one who drafted the second Massachusetts Constitution, which included its Declaration of Rights. And his creation undoubtedly was helped by the fact that he was deeply read in history, and he was a lawyer, and he knew a lot from having read other state constitutions. He and Jefferson had kind of a lending library going on of state. I'll swap you New Jersey. Have you got New Hampshire? Oh yeah, we've got the New Hampshire. I can swap you that for Maryland. They're swapping these documents back and forth in the mail, as well as the summary of ideas that Adams had put together a few years earlier in 1776. Adams had published his volume anonymously, The Thoughts on Government. And his thoughts on government basically laid out the kinds of things that a government should do and how a constitution ought to get written. And so when he was drafting this state constitution for Massachusetts in 1779, he draws up an elaborate Declaration of Rights. It's one of the longest, right? Remember, they're all stealing from each other? Well, now he's got 13 other documents to steal from. And so he's got this enormous long list of rights. It's one of the most comprehensive lists created by any of the states in this period. And the document stressed that there would be restrictions on government, that there would be built-in checks and balances, there would be two houses in a legislature to offset each other, and that there would be a strong executive. These features and many more, he took a lot of the features from those town complaints. He sat there and he read them. And so a lot of the town complaints he built into as parts and parcel of the new Constitution. And he also had some material in his that we don't see, it's not copied, it's not found in earlier state constitutions, and it's not found in the US Constitution. But it's an interesting provision. It says that each branch of the legislature, as well as the governor and council, shall have the authority to require opinions of the justices of the Supreme Judicial Court upon important questions of law. They can basically ask the judges for advice. There doesn't have to be a case or controversy in front of the court. The governor, the council, and the legislature can ask at that point, the Superior Court of Judicature for its opinions on pretty much anything. And you don't see that anywhere else. And after minimal modifications by the convention, basically they didn't change very much. They sent it out to the good people in those 260 towns, and they approved it. It went to the town meetings. There was a deadline of June 13th in 1780 for the towns to accept or reject this document. And after reviewing all of what the towns had to say and all of the votes that the towns took, the Constitutional Convention said that the document had been approved. Not really. In fact, if you go into the archives, and Samuel Eliot Morison did this back in the 1890s, if you go into the state archives in Massachusetts and you start totting up how many towns voted against how many provisions in the 1780 document, it wouldn't have passed. But instead, the Constitutional Convention said, yeah, it passed. Enough of the towns have approved it that we're going to say it's okay. It was probably short a lot of votes. But that didn't come out for about 120 years. And what happens really, the big takeaway here, too, Massachusetts is still considered to have the oldest working state constitution that hasn't been replaced by a subsequent document. It's been amended, but it hasn't been replaced. And so even though it wasn't the first one out the gate, even though there are all those other state constitutions that were printed and written before it, it's the oldest one that's still basically the same way as it was when it was written in 1780. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Massachusetts has the distinction of being the first state to use a convention to create a document and then seek popular ratification by the people. And that's the method we used in 1787 with the national constitution. And so it provided a template, if you will, for how to do it, how to get a constitution accepted by the people. Let's do it the way the people in Massachusetts did the second time. So these constitutions, we can celebrate them, we can say they're fantastic. They were certainly celebrated in their own time. But there were practices that were violated almost from the very beginning. That is to say, even after they created this document, that they then turned around and didn't follow it, which is kind of hard for us to understand. Why would they create a document and then not go along with what it actually said? Well, and Massachusetts is not the only one. Basically, they all did the same thing. They all violated their state constitutions in exactly the same way. Article 30 of the Massachusetts Constitution says that the legislative department shall never exercise executive or judicial powers. The legislature is supposed to make laws, right? And the judiciary is supposed to consider them and how they act upon people, right? Well, the Assembly in Massachusetts continued to act like a court of appeals. They continued to tell the High Court what to do about specific case decisions. And Article 25 says no subject ought at any time to be declared guilty of treason or felony by the legislature. And they went right on doing it. They declared people in Massachusetts guilty of treason. The legislature took their property and banished them. No trial. And this happened in every state. Every single state said the legislature should legislate and the courts should be the ones who hear disputes. And all of the state legislatures did this. They kicked people who were loyalists out of the country and took their property. Now, the state constitutions, when they were created, were extremely popular. They had quite an international reputation. The first ambassador to France, Ben Franklin, 1776 to 1786, took copies of them with him to Paris, where he had them translated into French, and then distributed them. Now, that meant that not only could the French read them, but of course, French was the language of diplomacy. And that meant the Russians could read them, the people from Italy could read them, the people from Spain could read them. It meant that basically the state constitutions became available to all of the diplomats living in Paris at the time. So, this is very much an important contribution on an international scale. This is how our state constitutions begin to get known and begin to gain kind of cultural currency outside of the United States. And that's why other countries begin to say, hey, maybe we need a document like this too. Before the US Constitution, 10, 11 years before the US Constitution, the state constitutions are becoming well known. And of course, part of what they're doing is making sure that the Wilkesite point of view is the one that we all remember, right? That a constitution sets limits on authority, sets limits on what government may do. And that is a major change as well. They reject the old-fashioned English view and fully embrace the Wilkesite view. Okay, so now we go to the very last part of this talk. We're past the second state constitution of Massachusetts, and now I wanted to talk just briefly about the second round of constitution making. You would think that the people living in early America would have had enough of writing up constitutions by this point, right? I mean, you'd think they'd want to do, go bird watching, right? Do anything else. But in fact, a number of states after Massachusetts go back to the drawing board. They go back to the process of writing a new constitution. Nearly half of America has 27 different state constitutions that are written before the year 1800. And nearly half of the action comes after 1783, after the war is over. Vermont goes back and revises, Georgia goes back and revises, New Hampshire writes a new one. Remember, New Hampshire was first, right, 1776. They write a new one in 1784. Pennsylvania drafts, they had one in 1776. They go back and draft a new one in 1790. South Carolina had two by this point. And now they have one written in 1790, and so on. Even states that we consider lost. Franklin is the third one from the top, and the people living in what would have been the state of Franklin had not one but two state constitutional conventions. And if you're asking, where's Franklin? The answer is it's the western part of North Carolina and the eastern part of Tennessee, and they wanted to be their own state. And they thought that the way to prove that they were their own state was to hold a constitutional convention, right? Have delegates come, we draft a convention, we draft a constitution, we send it to Congress, only in Franklin's case, Congress didn't accept their constitution. So they tried again the next year. They thought, well, maybe it's defective. And they sent that one in, and the Congress didn't take that one either. There are places that are trying to gain recognition by drafting state constitutions, and in some cases, Congress is not recognizing them. Now, why are they redrafting? A number of reasons. They're redrafting to follow the Massachusetts second method of having a convention, because a number of these states had not held conventions. In fact, all of the states who had written state constitutions before Massachusetts in 1780, none of them had used a convention. And now a lot of them want to do that to gain legitimacy. A number of them are trying to change things to rebalance government a little bit, to make the executives a little stronger, to make the legislatures a little weaker. What's interesting is in the 1780s and 90s, what are they reading to create all these new state constitutions? And the answer is they're reading each other. They're not looking at the US Constitution. Strangely enough, as much as we venerate the US Constitution, they were much more enamored of state constitutions. And so they read each other's documents to see how could we improve what we've got. Delegates were far more likely to contend the best model, to the extent they were seeking the model, was the constitution of another state, not the US one. And so copies of state constitutions, you can find them all over. You can find copies of New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts in the Georgia State Archives, because it's like a lending library. They're constantly sharing copies of each other's constitutions. Now, there's some unusual provisions, and this is where I'm going to wind things down for this evening. There are some interesting provisions that are found in this second wave of state constitutions, and I'm sorry, I don't have any pretty illustrations or anything like that, because it's just, there aren't any things that illustrate these ideas. But one of the interesting elements that emerged in state constitutions or in bills of rights from this period was the right of the people to alter, reform, or abolish their state constitution. That is to say, in many of these early state constitutions, the second wave, what they're doing is they're reserving the right to blow up the first one, which is in fact what many of them did. Except in the first state constitution they wrote, they didn't put that one in. And so they write into their second constitution, you can come back and alter or abolish this. We did. Right? And so that's a new provision that they will put into their state constitutions, that you can get rid of a government when a government's purpose becomes perverted, as they put it, perverted and public liberty is manifestly endangered. This language shows up in the Pennsylvania 1790 Constitution, which said that its people had an unalienable and indefeasible right to alter, reform, or abolish their government. If we don't like it, we can blow it up. The people in Delaware copy that. The folks in Kentucky copy that. In Kentucky, it's in their 1792 Constitution. The people have at all times an unalienable and indefeasible right to alter, reform, or abolish their government and get rid of it. Now, this is doomsday language, and you don't see that in the US Constitution. It's not there, right? That sort of language is not found in the national Constitution, although it's certainly implied, because they blew up the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were our first national government, and they didn't work. And so we drafted a new document to govern us nationally in 1787 and implicitly blew up the Articles of Confederation, which, by the way, had a clause that said they were to work in perpetuity. The Articles of Confederation actually were supposed to work forever. And it barely made it a decade, and then we blew it up. All right. Other elements that disappeared from state constitutions and the ones that were drafted in the 80s and 90s didn't have anything to do with the national constitution. The requirement that people own property began to disappear. And the requirement that they pay taxes before they could vote also began to disappear. And you might wonder why it was that places as far away as South Carolina and Delaware are getting rid of their property requirements and their tax requirements in order to vote. And part of this has to do with other places becoming attractive. The brand new state of Vermont and the Northwest Territory let you vote and you didn't have to own property. You didn't have to pay taxes. And so people who are relatively poor, who are not going to be able to buy land, who are not going to be able to pay very much, move to Vermont and the Northwest Territory, and it begins to depopulate these older states, places like South Carolina, places like Delaware. And if they're going to keep people from migrating out of their state, they're going to have to change their requirements. And so, in places like South Carolina and Delaware, they drop the requirements for being a taxpayer and for being a property owner to vote. Kentucky was also contested ground, and I'll stop here with Kentucky. Kentucky had a number of clergymen who had been elected to their legislature who wanted to get rid of slavery on religious grounds. And of course, in Kentucky, there were also a large number of people who had emigrated there from North Carolina and Virginia who were slave owners. And they got tired of the fact that the clergymen kept bringing up, we should get rid of slavery, we should get rid of slavery, we should get rid of slavery. And so what happened was when they drafted the Kentucky Constitution in 1792, they inserted language that said that clergymen could no longer serve in the state legislature, that clergymen were not permitted to serve. And then other states began to copy that. Georgia copies that language for the same reason. So, these state constitutions from the 70s, 80s, and 90s are often overlooked. A lot of people don't pay attention to them. They're not as jazzy or as snazzy as the US Constitution. But, we assume that the national Constitution was the most important thing floating around after the Declaration. And what I hope you figured out this evening is that state constitutions were incredibly important to the people who were rejecting them and creating them and then later rewriting them. And I think I'll end here and take questions. And thank you. Yes?
Are there any other, lost states that sent in constitutions?
That sent in constitutions, no. There's not another lost state that, like Franklin, that sent in a constitution. There are other lost states that asked for statehood. There's the western part of, he's asking about, are there other lost states? And the answer is yeah, there are at least two more. In the western part of Pennsylvania, the eastern part of Ohio was known as Westlvania, which really rolls off the tongue. Yeah, there's Westlvania. There are people in what becomes Vermont. There are people in what becomes Vermont that are bidding for statehood during the Revolution, and they call themselves the holders of the New Hampshire deeds. And they try to declare their independence and their ability to sit, and the Congress refuses to recognize them. So there are several that are out there. Yeah, absolutely. I went to law school and studied for my doctorate in history, so I love this stuff. I think it's great. But, I can understand that other people feel differently and may or may not have questions to ask, but I'm happy to answer any others. Yes, sir?
Sam and John were very much involved. Who are some of the other founders that were involved in this?
Well, there are a number of them involved at the state level. But we privilege the people who leave us a lot of documents, right? Adams and Jefferson left us a lot of documents, so we talk about them endlessly. But there are a lot of other folks who we don't spend as much time on that we should. For example, there's an individual named John Dickinson, and John Dickinson was one of the first people to start writing about how a constitution should limit what a government can do. He wrote the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, and it made him famous because people eventually figured out his name and who he was. But the letters from a blank became a kind of a title that a lot of people borrowed. And if they didn't borrow it for the title, then they would list that as their pseudonym, from a farmer, of Massachusetts, not of Pennsylvania. So John Dickinson is one that we have a tendency to overlook. And he was tremendously important in both Delaware and Pennsylvania. Their proximity meant that it was possible for Dickinson to be both a governor in Delaware and later a governor in Pennsylvania, because he owned land and worked in both. So he's somebody I would recommend that you maybe try to learn more about, that he doesn't get a lot of press. One of the reasons he doesn't, and one of the reasons like John Hancock's another person who we know the signature, but we don't know much about him, for the same reason about John Dickinson, and that is that after they died, their papers were scattered. And so there wasn't a body of letters that were easy for folks like scholars to go root around in and start reading. And very recently, some scholars have begun to put together edited collections of the Hancock papers and of the Dickinson papers, and that's how we're coming to know more about those two guys. They're very much overlooked. You have a question?
Yeah, I did. I have found out that I have a lot of Quaker in my family. Very
Yeah.
States. What part do Quakers play in this?
William Penn was a Quaker, yes, absolutely.
Pennsylvania's named after Penn, so what part do they play?
Well, you may not like my answer too much. The answer is that Quakers were often thought of as borderline loyalists because of their pacifism, right? It's one of the rules of discipline of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, that they will not take up arms against their fellow man. And if you lived in early America and suddenly people in Pennsylvania are starting to shoot the British and you refuse to take up arms, people will reach a conclusion about where your sympathies lie. And so a number of very well-to-do Quaker men were actually rounded up and carted off and sent into internal exile in Virginia. And this happened to a number of prominent Quakers in Pennsylvania who refused to fight. Now, another prominent, sometimes described as a Quaker, but not really, is John Dickinson, the fellow I was just talking about a moment ago. He had been raised with Quaker principles, but he did not attend a local meeting. And so he had a knowledge of and a sympathy for Quaker principles and beliefs, but one of the things he did, he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence, and then he went out and enlisted as a soldier. So he didn't want independence. He's one of these people who's fighting for reconciliation. And when independence comes, he realizes, okay, we can't get reconciliation, so staying in this government is not for me, but I love my country, and so he went and fought. But like I said, some people think of him as a Quaker and other people don't. A number of Quakers left what became the United States. They moved to Canada or they moved to the Caribbean. There's a large body of Quakers living in the West Indies, and a fair number of them moved there.
Some of my family that were Quakers served in other ways. They didn't take up arms, but they helped to supply food and clothing to the families.
Right.
People that were in service, and they found other ways to serve.
Yeah. And there are a number of people who were, depending on how strict the meeting was, and it depended on the locality, in some meetings, those actions would have been viewed as helping the military effort. But in other meetings, failure to do that would get you basically treated like a pariah. It really depended on the local meeting, the quality of the local meeting. And there's a large body of Quakers living in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, after the war shifts to New York and the armies are going back and forth through New Jersey like there's a turnpike, a lot of the Quakers there give up their pacifism and join one side or the other. Because it's impossible not to get raided by one side or the other. Staying neutral is just not an option. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that it was a compilation of constitutions were translated into French. Is there any evidence that that had any influence with the French Revolution?
We don't know whether or not the state constitutions being translated had any impact. It is clear that the amount of money that America borrowed from France put the French government so far much further into debt than it already was, that that's probably the clearest trigger point for the French Revolution, is that the government had overextended itself on our behalf. That's the reason why the Minister of Finance, a guy named Tourget, didn't want the king, or he didn't want anybody to sign for Ben Franklin's notes whenever Franklin would show up and would try to wheedle and plead and beg and whatever. And Franklin was really good. And they ignored Tourget and they signed. And so we got the money. But that's probably the clearest trigger. But in terms of constitutions, I mean, it's not just with Franklin that they're translated and sent. When Jefferson goes over and replaces Franklin and becomes the first formal ambassador received by, let me back up. Franklin is the first minister, the first person we send to try to cope with the French. But Jefferson has the distinction of being the first official ambassador. And when Jefferson goes over, he takes copies, not just of state constitutions, but also the Declaration and the US Constitution, and he has them translated into every language. He takes copies of the Virginia Statement on Religious Freedom, and he has it translated into Italian and sent to the Pope. I mean, Jefferson would do anything, right? So there's a lot of American documents that are floating around in translation in Europe, but it's difficult to find out how much causation there is in terms of what it may have triggered. The references are a lot clearer in our own hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere, it's a lot more obvious what the impact is. Yes, ma'am.
Can you recommend a text to me that focuses on the part where you talked about the state legislatures ignoring their own constitutional rules, doing such things as declaring people traitors, taking their property, kicking them out?
Sure. There are a number of books that have been written about loyalists. So the American historians only really started writing about loyalists in the 1960s. Before that, it was really a field dominated by Canadian historians, because so many Canadians were themselves descended from loyalists who left the country and went to New Brunswick or one of the other Maritimes. So one of the earliest books that you could go take a look at would be by Mary Beth Norton. And the title is something really simple like The British Americans. And it's all about loyalists who went to England. But the book starts with why so many of them left. And it talks about the kinds of legislation that was passed that banished a number of them, that took their property and so forth. A more recent book about loyalists would be by Maya Jasanoff. Maya Jasanoff wrote a book called Liberty's Exiles. And that book follows the lives. Each chapter is a different place, and it follows where loyalists ended up. But it all starts with how they got thrown out of, or why they chose to leave the places that they were. And so some of them are the people who are leaving because they're treated like they've committed treason. And her book traces people to West Africa, to the Caribbean, to India, to a number of different locations. And that's a really engaging book. I would recommend that one. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Well, the lands in Virginia were among the oldest that had been farmed for tobacco, and tobacco really depleted the soil rather heavily. And so people are leaving Virginia as early as the 1750s and 1760s. They're looking for new land. This is part of George Washington's first career. He was a land surveyor in places like Kentucky. And so there are people who are planning to leave very early. And once there's a big enough body of people living there, they're going to look for statehood after 1776. So Kentucky and Tennessee and Vermont are the first three that really push hard for independent status. Strangely enough, the people from Virginia end up going to Tennessee, and the people from North Carolina end up going to Kentucky. It's a crisscross pattern, which is very odd, but that's just the way it worked. But it's Tennessee, Kentucky, and Vermont that are the first ones that petition for being admitted as states. And the Congress puts off Vermont as long as they can, because the lands in Vermont were claimed by both New York and New Hampshire, and it was going to be a mess. And they put Vermont off until 1791. I mean, a long time to wait when there were plenty of people living there, but that's how long. So, and after that, settlement is mostly going to run west from Pennsylvania. If you can get over the mountains, you can get to Ohio, and then it's pretty flat. Right? Yes, sir.
Yes, Professor, you mentioned a number of states were borrowing from each other to develop their constitutions.
Yeah.
In the development of the U.S. Constitution, do you see maybe the top 1 or 2, 3 states that were more influential in developing our U.S. Constitution?
Yes.
Like Virginia, Massachusetts.
Yes, absolutely. Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania are 3 of the ones that play a really strong role in shaping what happens in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Every set of state delegates to that meeting, and of course Rhode Island doesn't send anybody. Rhode Island is the punchline for, if a state doesn't do something, which state is it? It's probably Rhode Island. Rhode Island doesn't send anybody, but all the other 12, they lean heavily on texts from Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, in part because they admire some of the details in their creation, in part because they admire their creators. But they have long arguments, 3.5 volumes of arguments in Farrand, the records of the First Federal Convention, about which parts they should borrow, and they argue with each other. One of the things that they don't put in a Bill of Rights, and one of the things that they say is, well, New Jersey didn't need one, and so they don't have a Bill of Rights. And of course, when the U.S. Constitution gets sent out to the states, the first thing the other states say is, where's our Bill of Rights? And they would try the same argument again about, right, New Jersey didn't have, well, the people in New Jersey seem fine. The idea of a Bill of Rights comes up very, very late in September when they're just on the cusp of being done, and they are worn out. They are done. And if they'd had to sit there and figure out what we're going to put in a Bill of Rights, they'd have been there another month, and they'd had 3.5 months in the Philadelphia sweltering heat with the windows closed, right? And they were ready to go home. So they said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. And when they take a vote, I think it gets voted down like 11-0, because they think, well, New Jersey doesn't need one, right? So there's some things that they're obviously modeling and some things that they get wrong, right? Yes, ma'am.
Of these first constitutions, how many of them address the subject of slavery?
All of them. All of them do. When the revolution begins, slavery is legal and practiced everywhere. We think of it as a Southern phenomenon, but in 1775, slavery is legitimate and practiced in all of these states. And it's an open question. Go back to the Massachusetts, the draft from John Adams, Article 1, all men are born free and equal and have natural, essential, and unalienable rights. And that went to court after 1780 to say, does that mean that there's no slavery in Massachusetts? And it took a very famous case, the Quock Walker case, to decide, yeah, the state constitution got rid of slavery, but it was still open for debate even after Adams drafted this. In states where they have to figure out taxes or how they're going to apportion representation, they'll have to figure out, are we going to count slaves or not? Are we going to allow slaves to be imported or not? It might surprise you to learn that in Georgia's first charter from 1735, slavery was not allowed. And they went back and asked for a new charter in 1750, which they got, which permitted them to have slavery. And after the Revolution comes, it's Georgia and South Carolina that talk. They're among the first to talk about abolishing slavery because they see that there are difficulties. I mean, obviously, there are far more ethical problems about how we treat our neighbors than just them figuring out what the law should be. But they're thinking about doing away with it. And Virginia and Maryland come within a hair's breadth of abolishing slavery after the Revolution. It's very strange to think about in the 1790s. In Virginia and Maryland were the two leading states where slave masters were manumitting enslaved people in the thousands. And then it stopped. Stopped in like 1795. And I always ask students, that's a what if. What if Virginia had kept on emancipating, had allowed people to go on emancipating slaves? How different our history might have been, right? But the answer to your question is, which constitutions dealt with slavery? They all dealt with slavery, implicitly or explicitly. It's Vermont that is the first to say slavery is abolished in a state constitution. Bear in mind that when Vermont's constitution said that, there were only 400 enslaved people living in the state of Vermont. It's easy to get rid of an institution when the economic impact is so slight. It's harder when it's a bigger part of the economics and the social and cultural structure that gave people a sense of superiority to each other. It's a different world. But the answer is slavery's in all of them, one way or another. Yes, sir.
That statement, all men are born free. Is it referencing men or mankind?
The answer is when they wrote the word men, they are using a gendered noun that we now choose not to read as gendered. We choose to read that as mankind. But in their time, most of them viewed that as men only. It might surprise you to know that in the New Jersey state constitution, it used the word people. It always talked about people. And New Jersey was the first state where women voted because they had the right until their state constitution was replaced, which I think is 1812, with their second state constitution. New Jersey, women voted. So it's always a bar bet. People say, well, what's the first state constitution where women could vote? And they always say, Wyoming. It's New Jersey. Yeah. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of question time, at least the public part, but if you have questions you want to ask, please come on down. I'll be happy to chat with those of you who have further questions but want to ask them in private.